Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review of Love Lies Bleeding starring Kristen Stewart. It's an A24 film. I saw this trailer back when I went to go watch The Iron Claw in theaters. And I remember right after the trailer finished, I poked Kelsey and said, I want to go see that movie. And she said, I do not. So I went to go watch this movie alone. Kirsten Stewart plays this reclusive gym manager who falls in love with this bodybuilder who has been hitchhiking across the country. Her dream is to go to Vegas to this bodybuilder competition, and Kristen Stewart helps her out by giving her a free gym membership and then hooking her up with a bunch of steroids in order to prepare for the competition. And then both of their lives kind of clash together when the bodybuilder gets a job with her dad. She gets a job as a waitress at her dad's gun range, which I found a little bit odd, but I guess since the movie is set in 1989, they used to have restaurants at shooting ranges. And her dad is involved in some pretty shady criminal activity. And that's really all I can say about the family and the criminal activity because it's so essential to the plot. And this movie has a lot of ups and downs surrounding their interactions with her dad and all the things with their family. It's basically a really toxic relationship, which I think Kristen Stewart plays so well. She has become, I don't want to call her one of my guilty pleasure actors, but she is somebody that I am always just curious about her work. And I know some people have maybe an issue with her because how she is in interviews and maybe how she is in real life, which we really don't know a whole lot about that, about her personal life. But for me, that is what I find the most appealing about her. I think for a period in my life, I was really attracted to girls who would probably ash their cigarette out on my face, treat me really horribly, stand me up, be really awful to me, but I would come crawling back to. That is the vibe I get from Kristen Stewart. She's almost to the point that even though I'm a huge fan of her films, I would probably never want to meet her in person just because I think it would ruin my perception of her. Even though if she was awful to me in real life, I'd be like, that's pretty on brand. I would be okay with it. But she plays that type of character so well. So maybe it is coming from a well inside of her that it's easy for her to tap into. But seeing her in a toxic relationship with a character who has a bad history with her father, is struggling through life. She uses her classic K-Stew mannerisms, I don't know. As soon as she starts doing that, I'm all in. And then her and Katie O'Brien, who plays the bodybuilder, have fantastic chemistry. They fall in love very early on in the film and go through all these ups and downs in their relationship. And man, it is quite the ride to go on. You also have Ed Harris as the dad, who I'm not the biggest Ed Harris fan, but I actually thought he did a really good job in this movie playing a jerk. And speaking of jerks, James Franco's brother, Dave Franco, is in this movie, who plays Kirsten Stewart's sister's husband, who is another really big jerk. And her sister is played by Jenna Malone. And Jenna and Kristen look so much like they could be real life sisters. I thought that was a fantastic casting. I feel like this is the most natural Kristen Stewart has been in a role. I love that this movie takes place in the 80s. Everything surrounding the aesthetic of this movie was really selling me. From the soundtrack and the score, which is a very 80s retro synth design. The thing I was surprised about is the dedication to smoking cigarettes in a movie, which for the better half of the last 10 years has become non existent. Probably for the better. If you put cigarettes in movies, a kid watches a movie and thinks, oh, that looks cool. Now I want to go smoke. Smoking is awful for you. I don't think if you watch this movie, you're going to go run out and buy a cigarette, but I found it interesting how much of the plot early on was focused on smoking cigarettes. And for a movie to dedicate so much time and emphasis on showing people smoking cigarettes, I kind of forgot that that was a thing. So not essentially that I love the fact that they were smoking all the time, but just to have that sense of realism again and showing the gritty side of these characters, I really appreciated the commitment to that. I think the biggest selling point of this movie is the fact that it doesn't really take place in reality. There are some supernatural elements that take this movie at times into a weird place. And being a crime, thriller, romance movie, I don't really feel like it reinvented the genre or did something so groundbreaking, but it took a lot of risks. Sometimes they worked out. Sometimes I found myself thinking, why did they do that? Sometimes it felt a little bit too out of pocket, but I love the fact that it took those risks. But I think if you are looking for a more realistic crime movie, you may see some elements in this movie and be a little bit turned off by, because I think to some they'll be hit or miss. So again, it does go a little bit off the rails sometimes, but I think that is playing into the chaotic nature of this movie, the messiness of these characters and their toxic relationship. So in order to have some really big highs in the movie, you have to go really low and you have to get really weird. And that is what this movie does. It is essentially a crime fairy tale. So as soon as you realize that and can kind of pull yourself out and realize that this movie doesn't take place in reality, then you can really fully enjoy this movie. So I almost wish it would have really committed a little bit harder to some of those supernatural elements, because at times it is so realistic, but then goes very fantasy, and I'm trying to find that line of where does my brain need to be to interpret the story here. And the movie does a really good job at keeping the pacing moving along. It keeps throwing things at you throughout the entire movie. It really felt like a crime thriller from the 90s, where this happens, therefore this happens. Now, how are we going to get into this? All right, we'll do this, and therefore this happens. It continues to move the story along. And for a movie that's right under an hour, 40 minutes, it really needed to do that. Maybe one or two times it dips just a little bit, and I started thinking to myself, all right, they're going to lose me here. But then, bam, they win me back. It hits you with more moments and gets you excited again and carries you to the finish line in a very satisfying way. They shot this movie in New Mexico, which I think fit the story perfectly, but it really goes back to the chemistry between Kirsten Stewart and Katie O'Brien and that 80s retro vibe. I really love the wardrobe in this movie. It didn't go into the full glam 80s. It's more realistic. You have Kirsten Stewart in these vintage tees, faded jeans, old worn out sneakers. Katie O'Brien is in the classic 80s workout gear. So there was a lot of attention to detail to make this film feel like 1989. I will say the guys look a little bit ridiculous in this movie. Dave Franco and Ed Harris have some ridiculous haircuts. And sometimes I found that taking me a little bit out of the movie, because I realized, oh man, they spent so much time on that hair and it looks kind of goofy. And as much as I tried to suspend myself from realizing that this movie didn't really take place in reality, there were some things in the plot that just didn't make sense to me. I don't want to give a whole lot away, but a lot of illegal activity happens throughout the story. And I just found myself thinking, is there nobody else witnessing this? And I know they were kind of playing off the fact that this town was a little bit deserted, not a whole lot of people lived there. But surely somebody would have been witnessing these crimes, and maybe it kind of would have ruined the plot a little bit, but a couple or maybe a few times I found myself thinking, okay, come on, really? Nobody else saw that? But overall, I feel like this movie has the potential to be one of my top 10 favorite movies of the year, pending everything else coming out. And I think it's because I went into it having a little bit of a bias of already being a Kristen Stewart fan, buying into the aesthetic of this movie, it being an A24 film. There were a lot of things going right for me to enjoy this movie, and then it delivered. It made me feel things, it made me angry, never really made me happy. Overall, you will leave this movie feeling a little bit bummed out. And even though I grew up in the 90s, it felt a little bit nostalgic and familiar, but then took it up on another level to really give itself its own identity. So for Love Lies Bleeding, I give it a strong, I would almost go 4.5 if it were not for a couple of things. I think a 4.5 is a movie that I recommend to everybody, but I could see some of the elements of this movie being off-putting to some, and I feel like a 4.5 is a movie that stays with me for a very long time. A 5 is perfect, but a 4.5 goes on to carry over into my love of movies year after year. I don't think I'll be rushing to rewatch this movie, but definitely think it's worth the in-theater experience, and if you can't do that, a must-watch at home. So I give it a strong 4 out of 5 steroid shots.